tree stood at the edge of the yard like a guard, silent and unmoving, yet full of watchful presence. It had always been there, long before any of us were born, maybe even before the neighborhood was built. Gnarled and twisted, its thick branches clawed at the sky, casting a perpetual shadow over the far end of the yard, and in the deepest grooves of its bark were strange markings, scratches that looked like symbols or letters in a language none of us knew. The older neighbors, especially the ones who'd been around since before I was born, had all kinds of stories about the tree. They said it was ancient, possibly cursed. They'd mentioned strange things happening around it, murmurs at night, flashes of movement in the shadows, voices carried in the wind. But to us kids, it was just an old tree, something big and creepy maybe, but nothing more. Until one day my neighbor's son Danny decided to make it the target of his mischief. Danny was 9, a year younger than me, but he was fearless, or at least that's what he wanted everyone to think. That summer he was over nearly every day, hanging out with me in the backyard. It was a quiet afternoon, and after drinking 3 cups of lemonade, Danny looked over at the tree and grinned with the kind of trouble only he could get into. "Watch this," he said, a glint of mischief in his eyes. He marched over to the tree, unzipped his shorts, and started to relieve himself right on its roots. I laughed at first, thinking it was just one of his dumb jokes, but then something changed. It felt like the air thickened around us, as if a cloud had settled over the yard, even though the sky was clear. The warmth of the day was replaced by a chill creeping in from nowhere. I could feel it prickle up my spine, making the hair on my arms stand up. Danny didn't seem to notice right away, but when he turned back toward me, his face was pale. His eyes were wide and unfocused, like he'd just seen something terrible. But he laughed it off, brushing away any sense of discomfort as we walked back toward the house. That night his mother came over, worry etched into her face. "Danny's been having nightmares," she told my mum, glancing over at me. Kept saying something about eyes in the bark. I tried to brush it off. Maybe Danny was just spooked. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. The nightmares continued, and Danny's behavior started to change. He grew quieter, less like his usual self. He was no longer the loud, energetic kid who used to race around the yard, whooping and laughing at anything and everything. Now he seemed distant, his eyes clouded, like he was somewhere else. "He's been talking to himself," his mum told me one day, "and he keeps staring at that tree." Sure enough, when I looked outside, there he was, standing just beyond our yard in the shadow of the tree. He was whispering, his head tilted as if listening to someone speak. "Danny!" I called out. He didn't respond, just kept muttering under his breath, his fingers brushing over the bark. I started to get the strangest feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was listening, answering him. That feeling stayed with me, even as Danny turned and slowly walked back to his house, his gaze still locked onto the tree, as if it held some kind of power over him. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the way he'd looked, like he was under a spell. Around midnight, I heard a noise from outside. Looking out my window, I saw him again, barefoot in his pajamas, standing under the tree. His face was blank, eyes staring straight ahead, and he was whispering again, though his voice was so soft I couldn't make out what he was saying. "Danny," I whispered, but he didn't turn. His hand touched the bark, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something, an indentation like the shape of a face pressing out from within the trunk. I blinked and it was gone. But Danny turned then, looking right at me. His eyes were dark, almost empty, and a shiver ran down my spine as I realized I wasn't seeing my friend looking back at me. "It's not done with me yet," he whispered, and his voice sounded strange, deeper and hollow. The next morning, his mother looked exhausted. "He didn't sleep a wink," she said. "Kept saying the tree wants him to come back." By now, even his parents were scared. They tried keeping him inside, but Danny always found a way to sneak out. One morning, after he disappeared during the night, we found him asleep under the tree, mud caked on his feet, leaves tangled in his hair. When his parents tried to pull him away, he fought them, his hands clinging to the roots, his eyes glazed over. "It's mine," he kept saying. "It wants me." Finally, his parents called in a doctor who suggested he might be experiencing night terrors. They tried medication, even a counselor, but nothing helped. Every night, Danny would end up back under the tree, whispering to it, pressing his hands against its bark as though it held some secret only he could understand. Then one night he vanished. His parents searched the house from top to bottom, then the neighborhood. They called the police, who searched the whole area. But Danny was nowhere to be found. His mother was hysterical, begging the officers to check the tree. They did, and they found nothing but leaves and broken branches. Days passed with no sign of him. His parents were devastated. The police searched for weeks, then months, but eventually the case grew cold. People whispered about the tree, how it had somehow taken him, consumed him. Some neighbors even talked about cutting it down, but it was as if no one dared. A strange, almost fearful respect kept them from going near it. I didn't go near it either, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Danny was still there, somewhere watching. A year later, on the anniversary of his disappearance, something strange happened. I was out in the yard, trying to stay as far from the tree as possible, when I heard a faint voice, a whisper carried by the wind. It was Danny's voice. "It's not done with me yet," it said, and a chill ran through me as I looked over at the tree. And then I saw it, a face. Faint but unmistakable, pressed against the bark, eyes open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Danny's face. Since then, I've tried to stay away, tried to forget. But every once in a while, on a quiet night, I hear him whispering in the wind, and I know, deep down, that the tree isn't done with him yet.